All right, it is 2 minutes past the hour, so while people are still continuing to join, we will go ahead and get started. So we have as much time as possible for our conversation today. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Lucy Barrier, and I am a policy analyst here at the Hunt Institute. I'm going to give a couple of logistical remarks and comments before I introduce our panel, and then we will get started. Today's conversation will include an audience Q&A that will be run entirely through the Zoom Q&A feature located at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will have a dedicated portion of the webinar for answering those questions, but you can submit them at any time throughout today's conversation, and we will get to as many as we can. Additionally, I hope that you join along with us on Twitter using the hashtag Race and Education. We will be live tweeting this conversation from our account at Hunt-Institute, and hope that you will also join us for further conversation there. Now I'm pleased to introduce our panel. Joining us for today's conversation around the retention of teachers of color are Dr. Travis Bristol, Assistant Professor at UC Berkeley, Dr. Faiza Jamil, Associate Professor at Clemson University, Dr. Nancy Gutierrez, President and CEO of the Leadership Academy, and Denise Fort, who is the Interim CEO at the Education Trust. Before we dive into our conversation, I would like to introduce also our President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, to provide some opening remarks on behalf of the Institute. Javed, over to you.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks for setting this fantastic conversation up. I want to thank our panelists in advance of the conversation today. I know how busy your schedules are, and I know the important critical work you're doing out in the field, specifically on this topic. In particular, I'd like to extend my appreciation to both Dr. Gutierrez and Denise Ford, who are both members of the Hunt Institute's Board of Directors. Denise just reminded me in the green room that she was actually the moderator for our inaugural Race and Education webinar series over a year ago. So I appreciate both of your time and your expertise. These conversations that we've been having over the past few months around the recruitment and retention of educators of color have continued to emphasize the urgency of this issue. But as we all know, we have to take action in order to make an impact. So I would encourage all of you to check out the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign that we launched in February of this year in partnership with other organizations, to include Denise's Ed Trust, which is dedicated to diversifying the profession. One of those partners is actually Teach Plus, who we are also proud to be collaborating with on this specific webinar series. This campaign is focused on eliminating the educator diversity gap by 2030. Our goal is to grow the ranks of our nation's teachers of color by 1 million in the next decade. We're also dedicated to creating the conditions that support that goal. To support teachers and students everywhere, we also aim to grow the ranks of our nation's leaders of color by 30,000 in the next decade. So I hope you'll continue to engage with us as on this journey to 2030 and 1 million. And be part of the goal. So thanks again for all of you taking time to be with us. I'm excited to jump into this conversation. Denise, I'm pleased to turn it over to you to get us started.
Wonderful. Thanks, Javed. And I am so glad to be back with you all again. I just mentioned how powerful these webinars have all been, particularly this last year. And the subject matter is compelling. Your speakers are amazing. And today we're going to add to that. So good afternoon, everyone. And I'm so excited to be here with you. We have a fantastic panel of experts to discuss some really actionable, intentional ways to support educators of color in the teacher workforce. I'm Denise Fort. I'm the interim CEO of the Education Trust. We are a policy, research, and advocacy organization where our entire focus is making educational systems work better for Black, Latino, Native, and students from families with low incomes and where they live at their intersections. We work to identify and support efforts that expand excellence in education, excellence and equity in education from preschool through college. So as we kick off this powerful conversation, I really want to ground us in the data to help us paint a picture for you of what we're really talking about here. As we all know, the majority of our country's school children are students of color, and yet less than 20% of our nation's teachers are teachers of color. We also know that just 2% of teachers are African American men. And research shows that while having a teacher of color is hugely beneficial to students of color, in reality, all students benefit from having teachers that come from diverse backgrounds and teachers of color. And so part of why today's conversation is so meaningful is we know that recruitment isn't the only challenge here. Yes, we do have a pipeline issue that, but it's not the only thing we need to address. We have some real data that discusses why educators of color are leaving the teaching profession at higher rates than their peers. A little over a year ago, EdTrust partnered with Teach Plus to dig deeper into why this is. What do teachers of color themselves experience? What challenges they face? What can teacher prep programs, school districts, and education leaders do so we can better support these amazing educators? We did this through a series of focus groups and case studies, looking at both what is taking a toll on educators of color and examining places where retention of teachers of color is high, because we want to know what's working. The report, and I love the name of this report, "If You Listen, We Will Stay," outlines our research findings and also pushes on state, local, and national leaders to take up a series of recommendations that can sustain and strengthen the pipeline for teachers of color. What we found is that while teachers are facing multiple pressures, 5 major challenges rose to the top. And this is where decision makers and leaders can take action. First, teachers told us they experience an antagonistic work culture, leaving them feeling unwelcome, and at times invisible. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that we did this before the pandemic, and we know already how teachers are feeling. So let's add that as a new layer. Teachers of color also feel undervalued because they take on more than their fair share of responsibility, yet they're not compensated or recognized for this additional work that they do. Teachers also feel that they're deprived of agency and autonomy in their schools because they aren't permitted to tailor their teaching to the students they serve. And fourth, teachers of color told us that they feel they're navigating unfavorable working conditions in workplaces that lack the support they need to grow as professionals. Lastly, these teachers bear the high cost of being a teacher of color, which takes a toll on them financially and psychologically. These challenges can burden educators of color, but these insights also help us identify places where policies and practices need to shift. I hold a very firm belief that the best, most effective policies and practices are shaped by and with, not for, the people most impacted by them. And so our recommendations for supporting the recruitment and retention of teachers of color center around the themes they identified as areas of greatest need. And we are pushing our policymakers at this very moment to value teachers of color more concretely by providing loan forgiveness, service scholarships, loan repayment incentives, and relocation incentives for teachers coming into the field. We need to push our policymakers to invest in recruiting, preparing, and developing strong, diverse leaders committed to positive working conditions for a diverse workforce. And at the Education Trust, we're also going to push to better collect and disaggregate data on teachers so that we can help do this. It is also crucial that we empower teachers of color by ensuring curriculum learning and work environments are inclusive and respectful of all racial and ethnic groups. At the recent report by the Center for Black Educator Development with Teach Plus, a new amazing report, which we were so excited to receive, it recently delved into the topic of creating culturally affirming schools for Black educators. The title of it, "To Be Who We Are, Black Teachers Are Creating Affirming School Cultures." I really encourage all of you to read the paper alongside ours. It is a treasure trove. Also, please join us at edtrust.org. We have recent data and policy tool that the amazing Eric Duncan put together that looks at how every state is doing on prioritizing the recruitment and retention of teachers of color. So those are the broad strokes of our recent research. And I'm really looking forward to moderating today's panel because the experts before you have also dug deep into what's needed, what's worked, and how we can use evidence-based actionable strategies to support our teachers of color and therefore the millions of students in our nation's schools. So let's get to the panel. Dr. Bristol, welcome. As noted earlier, we're just meeting, and I'm sad about that because your work is so powerful. You mentioned in your pieces in the CAPN that as we seek to diversify the teaching workforce, simply recruiting more people of color into the classroom is not enough unless coupled with the right strategies and investments for increased retention. What do you currently see as the biggest missed opportunity that policymakers could be implementing to better retain teachers of color, but aren't?
Thank you. Good morning. First, here from the left coast, Denise, it's so good to meet you finally. And Javed and your team at Hunt, thank you for continuing to do. Thank you for continuing to do this good work in service of our nation's children and adults in schools. So what we know, Denise, to answer your question, is that teacher recruitment efforts are paying off. So data from NCES, the National Center for Educational Statistics, reminds us that we're seeing smaller numbers or decreased numbers of white teachers enter the profession and increasing numbers of Black and Latinx teachers enter the profession. Anecdotally, I came into the profession because I saw an ad when I was in college from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund Foundation saying, you want to become a teacher, we'll give you $20,000. And so lots of these recruitment efforts in some ways continue to pay off. There have been lots of investments around recruitment for teachers of color in particular. And yet, this troubling trend that we see from the school and staffing survey, which is a nationally representative survey of teachers, we find that at the moment that teachers of color are entering the profession at a higher rate, they're also turning over at a higher rate. And so, and what we also know, I found from some of my own research, is that teachers of color in particular, and all teachers actually, they do not leave their students, they leave their principals. And so the driver, the reason that teachers point to why they're choosing to leave the profession is because of administrative leadership. And so to answer your question, the missed opportunity is a real focus on leadership. And so I'm so happy that that my friend, Dr. Nancy Gutierrez is here to talk about some of that work. And so some missed opportunities could be really looking at how states are providing the supports or the credentials to ensure that aspiring administrators understand these school-based experiences of teachers of color, are able to attend to those school-based experiences. A missed opportunity for policymakers is similar to how we have strong and robust induction programs for teachers. What are the induction programs for principals? Because teachers leave their principals, not their students. And so we've in this country continued to do a great job of thinking about teachers. We need to do more work and more investment in leaders and leadership. So I'll stop there and I'll put the CAPN piece in so that people can see that.
I love that message, and I think you really have hit the nail there. You can't have one without the other. You cannot have teachers without, the right leader in the classroom. And what does a school look like if it doesn't have the right teachers supporting that leader? Thank you for that. Dr. Jamil, so excited to have you here as well. Your research explores a very interesting connection between assessment and evaluation practices in our education system and the ability to recruit and retain teachers of color. Can you tell us a little bit more about how assessment practices impact the teacher workforce pipeline?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Denise. And it's a pleasure to meet everyone on the panel. Thank you for the opportunity to share my work. When we start our work in my lab, there's a few things that I wanted to clarify. I'm by training a developmental scientist. And so when we approach a problem, we always think of it in context and over time. And so when we think about the problem of retention, the first thing we have kind of examined is, where does our teacher pipeline actually begin? So often we start thinking of people as potential future teachers in high school when they're applying to college and making career choices. And so one of the ways that we have started examining the problem differently is we think of the teacher pipeline as beginning on the first day a child enters school, right? That's the first day they start engaging in our education system, and are being presented with new opportunities for their life and are developing ideas and thoughts about teaching as a profession. And what we learned then is that as we think about assessment practices across the lifespan and through our engagement with education, that we know as a profession create barriers for students of color, these start feeding into our pipeline and who even considers ever becoming a teacher, right? From early testing in elementary schools for entering gifted and talented programs, to what types of expectations teachers even form of students based on how they're performing on assessments or what they're observing in classes. So I've done some work in teacher expectancy effects using the early childhood longitudinal study. And we recognize that teachers are not always great assessors of students to begin with. And in particular, their expectations of students of color are inaccurate in ways sometimes that limit opportunities that are opened up to them. And that matters more for the academic outcomes of students of color. And as we play it forward, this becomes an issue for who's first recruited for opportunities in early recruitment programs like teacher cadets or pro team in middle school, but also continues to play out over college entrance exams, scholarship opportunities, praxis exams, et cetera, even before they enter the teaching profession. So we notice that there's this leaky pipeline that's disproportionately impacting students of color. And these assessment practices continue to be problematic, even as teachers are in the workplace. The other thing that I think our work is starting to focus on is when we think about problems, are we thinking about them in systemic ways? So when we look to understand the importance of having teachers of color in classrooms, are we considering how that is important differently in different contexts, under different conditions for different students? And so really looking at this as a multi-generational issue, right? We know that there's deep inequalities in the developmental context of individuals who even become teachers, and the places where they teach, but also there's this inequitable distribution of opportunities. So we're really starting to look at something that I think developmental scientists love. We look at complex problems in the most complex ways. And so some of our work has started thinking about how can we rethink assessment practices to start weeding out the testing biases, but also how can we be more intentional at every one of these formal and informal points of assessment, so that we're using our data that we gather in purposeful ways. So in particular, for example, we're currently looking at how is data that is collected. We spend a lot of time doing things like map testing. My own son is 13, and 3 times a year from the time he was in kindergarten, he has taken a map test, and it has provided really great information on what he's learning and how he's progressing. But our own work in schools has shown us that teachers aren't well trained to use that data to support their work. And so we're trying to think about in our education system, what kind of professional development can we provide our teacher candidates so that they're well prepared. And we're currently working on writing a grant where we can work with school leaders and teachers to start better employing assessment, not only to support teachers in their teaching practice, but also in understanding the experiences of the children in their classrooms. So creating a friendlier, more diagnostic environment where assessment is used to support growth for teachers and for students. And can we systematically do better preparation for teacher candidates so that they're well prepared, but then continue supporting them when they're in their classrooms. The other one is more about we're looking at the resources that are required to provide more equitable teaching environments, and how are those being distributed? We know that students of color are disproportionately attending schools that are under-resourced and underfunded, and teachers of color are systematically more likely to teach in these schools with fewer supports in place to help them develop. It's interesting, I came to this research as a teacher myself, and it was broadly an interest in teacher attrition. But right now in so many states, as we face sort of crushing shortages in teaching populations, and our entrance to teacher ed is dropping, and we're having trouble even recruiting students broadly into our pipeline to become teachers, we really need to start making sure that once people are in the pipeline, they stay in it at every point. And so we've been really focused on conducting the types of research that allows us to better target and connect that ethno-racial match of teachers and higher levels of diversity to understand those underlying mechanisms. So why, we all know that it's great for students to have a more diverse teaching workforce, but why is it helpful? And can we benefit by helping policymakers, but also research scientists have the tools to continue supporting that work to track its impacts better? So one of the things we are doing personally in my lab is we're developing and tracking teacher demographic data for every district in a state. We've done it for 3 states now over 10 years and attaching it to achievement outcomes for students. So we can start building a stronger policy case for why more investment in this is needed across all levels of the education system. And we've had some really compelling results already start to emerge.
Thank you. I really appreciate the focus on the system, because I think a lot of us forget how much that system controls just the practice, the hiring, the policies, and unless we interrogate the different pieces of the system, I don't think we're going to get this question right either. So I appreciate you bringing that into the picture. Dr. Gutierrez, your work at the Leadership Academy has been focused on leadership development at the school and district level. And we know exactly from what Dr. Bristol just said that school leadership effectiveness plays a significant role in teacher recruitment and retention. And having school leaders of color has a statistically significant effect on recruitment and retention of teachers of color. We also know that just like our teachers of color, we have a disproportionately low number of leaders of color. So taking all of this into consideration, how would you recommend that districts and states approach the work of recruiting and retaining school leaders of color? And should we have specific goals and strategies that should be in place in order to make that happen?
The answer is yes. It's good to be here. Thank you for including the Leadership Academy. We work with across 37 states, so we get to experience and engage a lot with various angles of this challenge. And first of all, I think the fact that we're talking about this issue on various levels of the system, teacher, principal, we can integrate superintendent there. 7% of our superintendents are, superintendents of color. 7%. Think about that. 53% of our students across the country are students of color. And so I think it's, first of all, thank you for doing this at multiple levels. And, we have to also do it with the end in mind. And, the goal here, in my opinion, is if we have 53% of students of color in this country, that's what your goal should be. Whatever it is in your district, whatever it is in your context, that's your goal. And it's a moving target, and that is what you should abide by. But I think, when Dr. Bristol was talking, and you said it twice too, and it hurt my heart both times. You said, teachers don't leave schools or the students, they leave principals. And I know that to be true. And I also know that one of the other reasons they leave is because they're not seen, because sometimes there's no room for advancement. And I want to break down a few stats here when I think about that. So in my experience and also in the data, we'll see that that leaders of color are often tasked with discipline, right? Are often put into this role where they're an assistant principal who's responsible for discipline, which means that other competencies are not developed, or other opportunities and doors are not open, because that is the role. And so they're not being prepared actively for the role of principal. The other thing to know is that principals of color will report, like 88% of Black principals and 90% of Latinos will say, I was an assistant principal before I became a principal, or which is very different than white teachers can move immediately to the role of principal. So I just want to note that too. And this is why we have to go back to being intentional. So I want to talk a little bit about intentionality and what that means and how we think about it. But, when we think, for example, when we were started almost 20 years ago, we were intentionally started to increase the number of leaders of color and women in the principal role in New York City. We were able to graduate 66% leaders of color, 67% women. So the fact that the New York City principal population right now is diverse, or the fact that even Central is diverse, is not by accident. Very, very intentional. So I want to be really, really clear about that. And we have also, programs right now, like in Massachusetts, Influence 100. I'll put a little bit more information about that in the chat. But in Massachusetts, they have almost 300 superintendents. And guess what? 12 of them are superintendents of color. Right. So it goes back to intentionality. Influence 100 intends to be done over a period of time, 3 to 5 years, and thinking about what this will look like, what it means. So that's one. And I think, I think what's also been mentioned today is that it's not enough just to put us in those seats, right? It's not enough just to say, all right, great, check, let me check the box, got a leader of color, all is solved. We also need a lot of development, a lot of support. One of the things we do with our programming is make sure that we have cohorts that create both bridging spaces and affinity spaces. Now, as we are in these roles, there's a lot of trauma. I know from my own experience, having gone to some of the schools that were considered the worst in California, that there's a lot that comes up for you when you are leading and when you are engaging in this work. And so those things are creating those supports are what really, helps us stay in these roles. And we have to think about it both, like it's not about excluding anyone, it's about giving people what they need to be successful within those roles, and guaranteed that when you have a superintendent of color, you're going to attract principals of color to that district. And when you have principals of color, you're going to attract and keep teachers of color to that district. I have so many thoughts, Denise, so I'm trying to, but this is just such a topic I'm so passionate about. I think the other piece is, when we talk about intentionality, it's like real investment. It's a real investment of finances. It's a real investment of programming. And so districts have the opportunity to create their own pipelines to do this really, really well. And we've seen that done across the country, but it takes actually a very bold leadership move to say, this is what you want to do. And that is something that leaders need to be able to say and put out there in a way that, in the way that they feel really, really proud about. And also the opportunity to create culturally responsive systems. That means that not only are you creating space for the kids to be seen, but also for the adults to be seen as part of this process. And so again, back to what keeps us in these seats, a variety of different roles. I have so many more. I think, I think the final thing I'll say just for this moment is that it's also about elevating the profession, right? Because if I think about, coming from a family of immigrants myself, like, when your family sacrifices so much to come to this country and to be here, your family might be like, I didn't come all the way over here for you to be a teacher. I did not come out, like, you need to be a doctor, you need to be a lawyer, you need to do something, and that's our fault as a society, is that we do not elevate this profession enough for it to be seen as something that is highly, and it is one of the most critical roles that anyone can ever have in our society, is that of a teacher and that of a principal and that of a person within education really advancing this work. And so I think it's back on all of us, the onus on all of us, to elevate this profession in the way it truly deserves, so that we can actually attract and retain and then provide opportunities for our teachers of color to advance within our systems the way they deserve.
Oh, well, you're going to get an amen from me, that we are all part of the amen corner. Thank you. Thank you. Both in terms of, I think, the intentionality, I really do think it has to be more than I want things to be better, right? You definitely have to want it, but you have to feel empowered and also take that power to be very intentional about the system that you are building for students and for teachers. So that was just really wonderful. We have some more questions, and I'm going to sort of open it up and ask folks to respond as they see fit. What I love this question that was in the Q&A. It spoke to male teachers of color and how, because they are underrepresented in certain subject matters, special education, elementary ed, should the retention of teachers of color be approached differently for teachers of various genders? And how can you navigate that? How do you explain how to navigate that? I'm wondering, Dr. Bristol, if you might want to comment on that one.
Yeah, so I'll just put one quick link to a piece I did several years ago about an affinity group I created for male teachers of color. And I would say, yes, somewhat. So this piece is about support. I spent 3 years studying New York City's male teacher of color effort called NYC Men Teach. And one of the things that we found, my team and I, Shannon Waite, Marcel Mentor, one of the things that we found was that when we interviewed principals of color who had male teachers of color in their building, principals of color seem much more aware of some of the socialized, some of the ways that men had been socialized to sort of not ask for help. So the principals of color were already aware that they had to go and seek out the male teachers of color and say, how can I help you? I know that you may be struggling. It's okay to ask for help. Where some of the white administrators believe that all teachers and these male teachers of color, that everyone sort of was the same. And so I would say that, again, as it relates to principal induction, that I imagine a good coach, a good principal coach would work with a principal to help that principal understand that that all teachers struggle. When I was a first year teacher in New York City, I struggled. And so it's incumbent upon you to go and ask that male teacher for help, knowing that men have been socialized not to ask for help, and in so doing, do themselves and their children a disservice. So I would say that would be the piece that I would focus on around what it means to focus on retention efforts for male teachers of color.
Thank you, and that I'm sure that resonates with a lot of folks that are on this webinar today. I think another really interesting question out there, are there well, all of you will be able to answer this question, I hope, like exemplar district schools who have programs or policies that are showing success in retaining teachers of color? And then I'm gonna add on, just to speak to this intentionality part. Is there a way that we can get at intentionality through some policy? And I'll just throw that out to you guys to think about it. But for now, are there exemplar districts or schools who want to shout out? Dr. Jamil, Dr. Gutierrez, Dr. Bristol?
Speaking from the leader lens, under the leadership of Superintendent Guadalupe Guerrero in Portland, Oregon, one thing he did recently was he, as part of an equity audit he did with us in partnership, he centered the audit around the experience of principals of color. Think about that. And think about, for example, Richard Elmore, God rest his soul, we used to always say, sometimes when we're teachers, we don't like to ask our students too many questions, because then they say something and we have to actually do something with what they say, right? So we like to stick to our lesson plan sometimes. It's same as you go higher. If we actually ask our teachers how they're doing, if we create that affinity space, back to the title of this webinar, if we listen, we have to do something with what we hear. So the fact that Superintendent Guerrero did that, now he has data, and it's not always data you want to hear, and it's not going to be, it's going to be real experiences. If you really ask people about their experience, which includes their pain and the harm systems have done to them as kids and as adults, you got to do something with it. And so I admire the fact that he was willing to go there. that he engaged us to do that. And now he has data. And so we're just in the process where it's been released, to the community. And now we have to figure out what's next. Another district, Des Moines, Iowa, during COVID, and after we all witnessed the brutal murder of Mr. Floyd, they did these anti-racist town halls across across the entire district, and did a lot of listening. And they said, what questions should we be asking? They asked their students, and the students said, here's what you should be asking. And they asked those questions. Just a really authentic, not coming with the answer, just a really authentic way of saying, what do I need to learn and know more about? I think that those are the most exemplary leaders and exemplary districts, people who are willing to be vulnerable, willing to really, really listen to what the experiences of people are in order to better themselves as a result.
I'd like to jump in and say that in some ways, I'm going to bridge the last two questions. I've been at Clemson now for 8 years in South Carolina, and Call Me Mister is a fantastic program that has been at Clemson for about 20 years. And in South Carolina in particular, we have such a need for more male teachers of color. And that program has been incredibly successful in recruiting young men, African-American men, to enter the teaching profession. But as it enters its, past 20-year mark, what we've seen is that so many graduates who have gone through that program become part of an affinity group for their careers, right? They become part of a line of mentors, and they continue to stay in the profession and become really important leadership voices. And in districts like Orangeburg, South Carolina, which has a pretty troubled race history, we've seen some really successful principal level leadership. And then now we're starting to see many of these young men who are now more experienced teachers start advancing into these leadership roles and into district level leadership. So that's been I think a very successful program that's impacted multiple districts across the state. So that's been an example of one that I think has been really powerful.
And I just put into the chat a couple of resources that folks can just click on. I'll leave time for other questions.
That's great. Thank you. Dr. Gutierrez, I'm looking in the Q&A, and someone has asked if you could share again the name of the principal from Portland and the audit that he did.
Superintendent Guadalupe Guerrero. And he did an equity audit focused specifically on the experience of principals of color in the district.
Great. Thank you. This is a great question from Jennifer. Thank you so much for this question, Jennifer. How can current teachers of color participate in being change makers in the recruitment and retention of other teachers of color? I love that. I love that. I love that question. Dr. Bristol, Dr. Gutierrez, Dr. Janu.
So I would say that, this African proverb that Linda Darling Hammond often uses is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so there's really power in numbers and critical mass. And so it's joining the hiring committee of your school in mass, because what I found in my study was that when one Black teacher joined, was the only person of color on the hiring committee, that the hiring committee found various and sundry reasons to say that those applicants who were of color were not a good match. So there's importance in critical mass, both at the school level, at the district level, to serve as a block, to maybe serve as an advisor to the superintendent. And so I would say going together in numbers and to put ideas down on paper. And I tell my graduate students that the fourth arm of government is the press. And so using the press to really shift policy. And so when you are working together, put ideas down on paper, write an op-ed to hold the adults in schools accountable.
I would jump in and say, they are the greatest advocates for students of color as well in their classrooms. Inspire a young person So often I feel that we encourage young people to think about careers as doctors and lawyers and engineers. And in a lot of ways, representation matters because students see themselves in their teachers. And so some of the work we've been doing really starts to suggest that that is a powerful but maybe long-term way of thinking about this. I'm at a football school. Football is life at Clemson. And we start recruiting football players when they're like 10 years old, but we don't really think about teachers at an early age like that. And so I do think that that's a real opportunity to start helping young boys and girls start thinking of their future and the impact they can have, because they are ready to be inspired to take on these careers.
I think, yeah, that if we're not thinking about growing the pipeline from a really early age, I think we are missing the boat. And certainly some of that, I think, should go along with professionalizing the workforce. Like when students see their teachers as professionals, they too want to be those professionals. The same way when, I was a little girl, I wanted to grow up and be a business leader. Because I had exposure to that as a young girl. Yeah, I think the same thing applies. It's really interesting. And I don't know if there's been some research looking at kids and how they enter in the pipeline, but I think that would be interesting. We have another question asking about education leaders from professions other than teachers. And is there any research that suggests that there are other areas from which effective educational leadership can emerge?
Is the question whether or not people other than teachers can become effective principals, essentially?
Yeah, I think so. Sort of, at the federal level, we had made a significant investment in alternative pathways to teaching and mid-career change pathways to teaching and leadership. And I think what the question here is there any research out there that suggests that we could tap into other disciplines to raise up other effective educational leaders?
I'm going to give this a practitioner lens, because I'm definitely, and I'll let my colleagues here speak to the research. But, I think it's a tricky question from a practitioner lens, because I would say we do have some amazing non-teachers who become school leaders, really amazing school leaders, but it is a small percentage. And I had my former assistant principal, who then became the principal, was this amazing Filipina counselor. She was a counselor, but we would always, the teachers gave her a really hard time. They would say, she would evaluate them, and they would say, you don't get me. And she would, and so she had to work really, really hard to position herself so that her feedback was accepted and used in a way that would actually grow our staff with credibility, because I think that's what sometimes non-teachers sometimes face within those spaces, is the credibility piece. The other thing I'll say is that women of color in particular, I know we've been talking about people of color in general, and we highlighted men, male teachers only 2%, which again is something that just hurts the heart. Women of color as leaders also have varying degrees of challenge, even beyond, like, as the higher you get in these roles, the more male they become. And there are certain biases that come along with being a woman of color in these seats as well. So it's almost opposite of what, the teacher versus the leader space. But that my opinion is that, that I think leadership matters. I think that effective leadership can come in many different forms, but I do think to have the credibility, our teachers often want someone who has experienced what they have experienced, at least the majority of the time.
One of the things that all of us have been reading about, and I think when we think about both microaggressions and workplace, the health of a workplace, are the recent conversations that are cropping up across the state relative to critical race theory. I'm wondering if any of you would like to comment on whether you've seen or seen or been able to speak to any teachers in those states and what they have sort of tapped into that allows them to continue to exist as a leader and a teacher of color in those environments. And I'll just throw that out for anybody.
I can't say that I have, so I'll punt to others.
Yeah, we're, it's hard. It's really hard right now. Because in some ways it questions our very existence as people of color in this country, our value, the value add we bring, the history that brought us here into this space. And so it's hard. I think the way to continue to exist is I don't know. It's hard. It's hard for me personally. But I think what we've seen, I think we've used the history as a model for how to advance and continue forward. For example, we can look at ethnic studies ban of 2010. We can look at the fact that, although that was overturned 7 years later, there were still lots of learning that took place during that time that required us to both stay true to our values while keeping our job. And some people didn't, frankly, some people didn't during that time. And so that the strategy piece, I think, is what is emerging. And I think one of the most dangerous things about this moment in time for leaders, for teachers, for whoever, is that there's this false dichotomy of, either you are down for the cause or you're a sellout, like it's either or. And really the real work is all the grayness and the complexities and the nuances in between. Here's what we know. We know that if you know your community well, and you use data, right? And you can come together around a common vision around advancing the experience of students within schools, creating systems that work, are inclusive and work for every single student, that you can continue that work no matter what. I personally am not going to die over a term. I'm not going to say, I have to use this term no matter what. And I'm not going to do that. I'm going to think about what it means to really adapt to the context and in that moment in time and continue to be inclusive of every single student in the room. And so I think that our teachers and our leaders are walking a tightrope. And I think they have to be very strategic and they have to know what that means to stay true to their values while engaging in really strategic thinking and action at this time.
The only thing I would just add is that teachers should continue to teach fact and not fiction. My fifth grader came home singing, "This land was your land, this land is your land, this land is my land." And I told her, like I tell my students at Berkeley on the first day, this land is not your land. This land is not my land. This land was not made for you and me. We are sitting on the land of the Ohlone people. And so that is fact. So as long as we continue to teach facts and not fiction, then this noise about critical race theory, which is just a distraction, I think will go away. We need to just continue to teach fact and not fiction.
But just a quick pushback, Dr. Bristol. I don't think it's going to go away. I think that's the problem. I think that it's a same playbook, different play. We can talk about the various times in history where the fear kind of overtook the strategy around how we create inclusive, equitable schools. And so I agree with you 100% around speaking truth to power. But I think that we have to really think about what it means to be strategic, because I think it's here to stay for a little bit, at least through the midterms. And that's the tricky part.
I would just add to that. I think maybe it's not something that we should leave on the shoulders of teachers on their own, right? I think that part of the solution here, part of what helps them survive, is the extent to which the community around them, their students, the parents in their classrooms, the leaders of higher ed institutions in the area, speak out and offer their voices in support as well. I know that currently Clemson is undergoing, our college is going through a process of implementing a strategic plan for inclusive excellence. That's a lot of words to say. We're examining ourselves deeply. And I'm leading one of the leaders of that task force. And we're trying to look beyond sort of the obvious things to start really examining how well are we preparing our our candidates to go out and be advocates. You know, how well do we even address these topics? How prepared are we as faculty to start having these conversations so that every student leaving our institution and entering a classroom, whether they're a student of color or a white student, or you know, whether it's someone who's becoming a school leader, at least is able to have these conversations about the power dynamics in school systems. Are we training them well? Is our curriculum adequate? Are we speaking up as parts of the community? You know, we're a land grant institution. Are we doing our job to support teachers and speak out when policymakers are, you know, at the local level are putting barriers in place to having those conversations? So we have been really examining that and sort of what part are we playing in this process?
That sort of brings me back to a statement you made earlier, Dr. Jamil, about the systems. And I'm just, could you tease that out a little bit more for us? Because I think both as, looks like there's a lot of practitioners on the webinar, but there are also policy folks and researchers. It'd be helpful to sort of identify more specifically what some of the, what are the systems that we should be focused on that will help both elevate teachers and leaders of color. I acknowledge their experiences and encourage, you know, and encourage more teachers and leaders of color to enter the workforce.
So I have a handout somewhere, it has been linked and shared, but the bottom figure is sort of how we've been thinking about this. And it's really, I'm a developmental systems theorist, so we really treat all development, all things that happen in the world as sort of living within an onion, right? So when we think about a classroom, so often we're focused on the teacher in the classroom and in that school. But that school doesn't exist in a vacuum. You know, teachers of color in South Carolina are facing very different things if they live in a rural part of the state where there is a history of violence against them. In, you know, there's so many things that we need to take into consideration. And so really looking at any one of these situations to consider what is the community around that school and that classroom providing. So looking at it from a community-based lens, moving out further to state policy level, to sort of the politics of the nation as we're discussing right now, and really situating that conversation in sort of where we are in time. Because so often, you know, when I moved here, I'm not a native of this state, and I realized that there was so much about the school districts in this area that I didn't understand. There were, you know, there were stories of the members of the school board. There was, you know, there were things that had occurred in specific communities that were influencing how teachers were being perceived and treated. And so sometimes I think we start looking at a very macro level. And so if we start treating a student and a teacher and looking at the interactions they're having, or a teacher and a principal and the interactions they're having, but really considering it more broadly in terms of what resources are available, what challenges are present in that specific context, and starting to adapt to really address problems within the context they're occurring. We realize that there are a lot of resources and supports available within the community that sometimes schools aren't drawing on. So if we can start helping that occur, then I think that we can start proposing solutions that are maybe broader. Because at the end of the day, when I was a teacher, the things that provided me stress in the day was, you know, an interaction I had with a student. And so often there was an accumulation of those interactions. And so often those interactions were part of a larger system of challenges that families were facing. And teachers play a complex role. They're a linchpin in a complex set of social interactions. And I'm not sure just professional development addresses that problem, right? If we start treating schools as the center of a community, and as a potential driver of positive social change, but also as a space where a lot of burdens are carried by individuals. because the students they work with, the families they are supporting have their own challenges. I think there's some relationship building there that we tend to miss. And so a lot of our work is starting to try to unpack that. In a particular community, in a particular district, how do we then take these sort of broad ideas and start disentangling, what are the underlying historical reasons that these policies exist? Can we address that so that we can really start pushing forward in more lasting ways? Because I do think too often we blame the test, we blame a current law, and we're sometimes missing those intricacies and nuances that are about the people and the place. So often for my work, especially, which is very much about quantitative modeling, we just control for these things, right? We don't really want to think about them. So we're really trying to be intentional in what data we're looking at and how we're using it and what questions we're aiming to answer, so that we can honor the individuality of a place and a point in time as we address the needs of teachers and communities.
That is so powerful. Thank you so much for that. We only have a few minutes left, and I'm going to take just one more question that I'd love to direct to Dr. Gutierrez, because it has to do with leadership. And the question did come from the Q&A, and I don't want to leave without asking it. The question is, what advice do you have for the 7% of superintendents of color and their boards of education so that they can increase the number of leaders of color? I think that's a great question. And also speaks to the system again, right?
Yeah, for sure. I spoke to a superintendent recently. I said, we were talking about this very topic. And she said to me, I've had to change my lens. Like, sure, this is about practice and about policy. She said, but I had to actually, it's also about my mindset. Who do I see as an effective leader? When I think about my own experience in schools and who I saw as the principal and who I see as the leader and who, if you closed your eyes and visualized who you saw as the ideal teacher for your kid, the ideal superintendent for the district in which you live, who would you envision? And I think it's an issue around mindset. So I think it's an issue around, yes, be very intentional, put programs in place, to intentionally build the capacity and build your pipelines, and hold up the mirror to yourself and think about how your own biases either advance or get in the way of that very goal.
Thank you so much. This has just been a wonderful, wonderful panel. I'm going to turn it back over to Lucy, but I really want to thank this incredible group of researchers, academicians, advocates, just all-knowing, gurus. Thank you so, so much. Lucy, back to you.
Thank you so much. I just want to echo all of that and more. This conversation has been so great and so many resources shared, which I know is going to be really beneficial to our whole audience. And thank you all for joining us for this. We are so glad that you were active in our Q&A and really engaged, and we just appreciate it so much. We do have some upcoming opportunities. In addition to this, we have webinars once or twice pretty much every week. So we do hope that you will join us again. This Thursday, we will be having a conversation around closing digital skills gaps. And then we have another race and education webinar coming up next Thursday on the intersection of anti-Black racism and adolescent development. And then on November 2nd, one of our early efforts webinars. And you can find all of these on our website, including all of the registration links. So I hope that you will continue to join us and engage. And the last thing is, when this window closes, there'll be a survey, and we hope that you take it so that we can continue to improve and better serve you. And thank you again to our amazing panel and to all of you for being with us. And we hope to see you again soon. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Jima, Dr. Bristol. Good to see you. Thanks, Denise.